Welcome to the Maritime Executives podcast series, In the Know. I'm Tony Munoz, Editor-in-Chief. Our Executive Corner podcast will provide conversations with top executives concerning events and issues that are shaping our industry today. We will also bring you up to speed with the latest news and editorials covered by the Maritime Executive. Hello, Maritime Executives, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have the privilege of having Dr. Jonathan Ward. He is an internationally recognized expert on U.S.-China global competition. He earned his PhD in China and Indian relations from the University of Oxford and an undergraduate degree from Columbia University studying Russia and Chinese languages. He is the author of Chinese Vision of Victory, and he has a new book coming out in April, The Decisive Decade, America's Grand Strategy for the Triumph over China. Welcome.
Hi, Tony. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. China's new Silk Road and Belt Road initiatives have aggressively expanded throughout the Mediterranean, Africa, and North Africa, including strategic seaports like Piraeus and Bremenhaven and Hamburg. Are these purely trade economic moves, or is there something more ominous?
Well, with the Chinese Communist Party, nothing is purely economic. I mean, that's the first thing that we have to understand in dealing with this adversary is ultimately they're constructing a global position in the world economy that they can use for strategic purposes to wield influence, power, essentially things that we would recognize in a prior century very easily as an imperial strategy. I mean, this is China going out and attempting to tie the continents of the world back to an international economic system with China as the center. And that's the Belt and Road, which spans, of course, the entirety of Eurasia, Africa, the Indian Ocean. And the maritime component of this is very important. I mean, they've built, at this point, the world's largest navy. They own and have built ports all around the planet, scores of them at this point. And they see that all essentially as a means to solidify their position in the world's economic geography and ultimately to apply military power across this entire system. So, their desire to control not only to dominate the international trading system, but also to control its physical infrastructure is something that I think caught many Western and democratic governments off guard and still requires a major counterpoint. And of course, the shipping sector sits right in the middle of all of this as a sector that's exposed not only to the macroeconomic issues of U.S.-China confrontation, but also to the many choke points that at this point comprise the geography of the general competition between China and the free world.
I know we, and throughout Europe, Northern Europe, and other places, there is a lot of conversation about that. We actually have people on the ground reporting for us in Africa as they expand through there, writing articles and sort of following that expansion. We have had a couple of European writers write for us about their concerns about the Chinese partnering up in Hamburg, major choke point. So we are, as an industry, very concerned in watching this happen. Let me ask you, is China about ready to invade Taiwan? Are there warning signs that they may soon come after Taiwan? What is your opinion on that?
So my view of this, I mean, on one hand, they've built a military that's essentially organized around this potential campaign to take the to take the island of Taiwan, or at least to blockade it or to harass it and coerce it militarily and economically. So I think the pace, as we've all seen, of Chinese military coercion of Taiwan has increased a great deal. The aircraft sorties, the exercises last summer after Nancy Pelosi's visit, I think took it to a new level in the past few years. And they're showcasing some of their capability now, and they're field testing all of that, in order to be able to actually execute something more serious. I mean, if we were to see a blockade, for example, they have to essentially see how that would work and see what their own capabilities are. But all things considered, I mean, it's still a very complex operation to pull off. I mean, to actually land on the island, hold the island, do all of that. I mean, it's something that I think we still get a large vote in this as the United States and as the allied free world. I mean, the ability to provide Taiwan with the necessary equipment for Taiwan itself to go through the necessary preparations. I mean, it's still possible to make this a very difficult undertaking for the Chinese military. So I think we have a closing window here in which to create deterrence in the Pacific, and it's really to recreate it. I mean, for many decades, this was not a viable operation, and that's breaking down. The military balance in the Pacific has shifted against us, in recent years in ways that make this very tough for U.S. as well. But there's still a window in which we can make this an intractable problem for the Chinese military.
Are we bound by the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act to defend Taiwan?
So what the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act really does is explain that we are going to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself. And that's, certainly, so in a way, we're, I think, operating in a very consistent manner with the original idea of how that's supposed to work. And there's something that's overlooked in this act, Tony, that I'm glad you've brought it up, because the actual text of the document says that one of the objectives of the Taiwan Relations Act is to make clear, quote, that the United States' decision to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. So the entire opening to China, the entire, sort of principle behind the establishment of diplomatic relations at all with communist China was that Taiwan would not become this flashpoint and center of coercion by the Communist Party. So of course they're the ones that are changing that, and they're going to blame a lot of that on the U.S. But we, I think, made quite clear in the opening decades of engagement with China that this was that they were to resolve this by peaceful means. So the fact that they've undergone what H.R. McMaster called the largest peacetime military buildup in history, that's really the problem here.
Yeah, definitely. Has the Chinese capabilities in military and navies throughout the Western Pacific, are they really a force to deal with, or can the defenses of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines position the United States to be able to, confront any aggression by the Chinese?
Well, as many analysts point out, I mean, China has a home field advantage here. I mean, this all takes place or would take place right off their coast. Now, that does not make amphibious operations easy, but it does mean that their ability to field, weaponry and certainly their missile advantage, I mean, all of that is in their favor. On the other hand, as you've pointed out, I mean, there are a variety of nations here that understand this problem very clearly and do not wish to see China break open the military geography of Asia. And as Chinese analysts point out, they call Taiwan the lock on the island chain. So the two island chains, one of which, of course, stretches from Korea down through the South China Sea, and that's where you have the Ryukyus in Taiwan and the Philippines, the first island chain, and then the second one going out into the Philippine Sea with Guam really as the U.S. military linchpin there. For us, those keep us in the Pacific, and for China, they see it as restricting them. So the idea that they could take Taiwan and transform the military balance of Asia is something that they've dreamed of really for quite a long time, and it also has serious ideological significance for them. It's linked to the Chinese Civil War and to the ambitions of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and that's why we see Xi Jinping making really sort of spotlighting it in his own rhetoric. But yeah, the nations of Asia did not want this to happen, and there's I think a pretty strong pro-US and pro-allied balancing coalition there. But the problem, of course, is that China's economic relations with many of these nations are their real advantage. I mean, the trading relations they've built with Southeast Asia, the fact that they have so many of our own corporations in sort of a headlock in the China market. I mean, all of this is one of their strong cards to play in undermining the sort of coming together of a coalition.
And it became reality for us in the United States and a lot of the West during COVID, when the supply chains stopped and the Chinese locked down their country economically. They're having problems now restarting. I think we're all concerned about that. But when Pelosi was in Taiwan, the Chinese started lobbing missiles over them and doing flying sorties. So they were being very aggressive, rattling that saber. I think the intent was to prove that they immediately could respond to any aggression by the U.S. or any of our allies in the region. I mean, are you concerned about them coming out of the lockdown, them starting to restart their economies, and do we have them in a position where they're willing to negotiate and are less aggressive coming out of COVID?
Well, I think that one of the major strategies that they've started to talk about really during and prior to the pandemic is something called dual circulation. And the idea there is that China is going to become less dependent on the outside world and yet tie the world closer to China when it comes to supply chains. And, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out last year, they actually increased their share of global manufacturing during the pandemic. So, it's not that I think there's a lot of talk and maybe a lot of study among corporate leaders about what this means geopolitically and how you diversify, but it doesn't mean that there's wholesale action to see people really moving out in ways that would have the right long-term effect. So I think China still remains, very much the center of global supply chains. And that's one of the fundamental problems that the US and all of our allies are going to have to work on. I mean, this is part of how we win or lose. I mean, we have a battle for the world economy ahead. And we've seen, I think, the first examples of what it looks like to do much stronger economic measures against a major power. And following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Western sanctions were on a totally different scale than they've been before and dealing with a much larger nation than, let's say, North Korea or Iran. So I think we're starting to see a precedent of what it might look like if you have to start putting economic pressure on a state like this. But I think eventually the end state is going to have to be to drastically reduce our dependency on China for supply chains, and also to take other measures towards economic containment of China, which I think still can be done. You really have to do that in the realms of trade, technology, and capital. And we've seen the Biden administration with export controls push that forward in terms of technological restrictions, but we're not yet seeing real restrictions on capital going into China. I mean, it's still flowing in through passive investment vehicles. Like all the major index creators are still pumping hundreds of billions of dollars of Western capital into China. And then, of course, corporates are also continuing to invest in order to remain competitive in that market. So really, we need to take an entirely different approach to the world economy in order to de-emphasize China's role. And that's where I think the whole game turns. I mean, you're not going to have long-term military deterrence because you won't have military superiority if they are able to continue to position themselves as, the major trading partner of many of the world's nations, a major source of investment, and increasingly a growing nation. I mean, let's not forget they are growing. That has not ended yet, even if it's slowed. And they're growing from a much larger base, even at slower rates than they did in the past.
So what I'm hearing is it really is in the boardrooms, the C-suites that need to be prodded to back off of China.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think this is something, as I've pointed out in many forums, I mean, this is not won or lost in Washington alone. I mean, this is going to be won or lost, largely by the business sector. I mean, at the end of the day, an economic competition is something that is very much in the hands of our business leaders. So for them to change their strategies to de-emphasize China, I mean, this is where business and national security, which have been very misaligned for really the duration of the U.S. awakening on China as a national security threat and as a dangerous actor, the boardrooms haven't got it yet. And that's what's going to have to change. I think there's the beginning of that, but the problem seems often too hard. And, we're going to need to realize that is the essence of this competition. I mean, you need to maintain, deterrence in the Pacific, but you also have to win an economic competition. And that means getting this into the hands of business executives so that their decision-making is much more realistic when it comes to geopolitics and much more, beneficial to the long-term security of not only the United States, but every allied and democratic nation in the world. I mean, no one will benefit from, China as the dominant economy.
no one will benefit. And what about India as it emerges? Are they more allied to the West, or are they part of the Russian, China, North Korea alliances?
Look, India has a fundamental choice to make here, and I think a lot of the 21st century, really does depend on this. I mean, this is,
Mhm.
if India is able to, embrace the world's democracies as a sort of strategic framework or lean towards the West much more substantially than it does today. I mean, that's going to be very good for the world in the long run. However, their traditional diplomacy has always been about balancing the different powers. So non-alignment was what it was called in the 20th century. And really that meant relations between, having relations with both the USSR and the United States. So still their relationship with Russia, which I think is they're one of the nations that has not really gotten on board with the Western response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And at the same time, their relations with China, I think, are very clear. I mean, this is their number one adversary. I mean, they fought a war in 1962 and, have already had violent clashes on the Himalayan borders, both in 2020 and also just in the last handful of months. So they know what that means. And I think, it's really a question of, will they turn closer to the United States? Can we let our economic relationship take flight and let our military relationship deepen, and have them ultimately as another cornerstone to the democratic and free world? And that's a choice that India, I think, has to make, and hopefully will make it soon, because there is sort of a Russia-China axis forming. I mean, it's not just Russia alone that we have to deal with, or China alone. I mean, they're working together, and they have for many years now. So the geopolitical field, I think, is starting to form.
Tell us a little bit about your new book, The Decisive Decade, and what advice can you offer Washington, D.C. and the allies in the region? We have a strong relationship with South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. In fact, the U.S. Is opening 4 new bases, including the Luzon Straits, which is just south of Taiwan. Give us your thoughts on that, please.
Right. So the Decisive Decade, in a sense, is a counterpoint to China's Vision of Victory itself. I mean, China's Vision of Victory was really the first book to show all the strategy documents of the Chinese Communist Party and explain that they had a global strategy to, become the dominant superpower. I mean, there are others that had intuited that, but this put the documentation together to demonstrate, strategies for every region of the world, how economics is at the center point, what their long-term, military goals are. I mean, all of that, I think, had really come out. And then my training as a historian had allowed me to see how they conceptualized the rise of China, even in the very founding years of the People's Republic of China. So pulling together the entire picture, the question then, of course, is what can we do about it? And that's, the Decisive Decade. This is, a U.S. grand strategy, what the United States can do to fundamentally dismantle China's global grand strategy. So I've broken it into the 4 arenas of classical grand strategy: economics, diplomacy, military, and then the arena of ideas. Basically, that this is actually very much a contest in which our values and ideas and ideals are all at stake. I mean, that tends to be true when there's a conflict of this magnitude among the major powers. So realizing that we are entering into this existential contest with China, with the Communist Party of China, and the fact that I say entering into because I think China's leaders have been playing this game for years, and we're only going through an awakening on this very recently. So essentially, as this shapes up, the bottom line, I think, is you have to win the economic contest. You have to be ready to do, in a way, what America has never had to do, which is to win an economic contest, a global economic contest with a major superpower. We did not have to deal with that with the Soviet Union. Even in the Second World War, the combined economic output of both Germany and Japan was about 1/3 of the United States. So we have all these lessons from our history, but we have to apply them to the current thing. And, this will not be resolved in our capitals. I mean, I think alone, I mean, that's obviously going to be the centerpiece of how we handle this. But we have to have an awakening across the business sector and get them into alignment, because at the end of the day, an economic contest, I mean, who are the real actors? It's the business community, it's the business leaders, it's Wall Street, it's Silicon Valley, it's the boardrooms and CEOs of every major strategic industry. And as you have a People's Republic of China, which, absolutely makes use of its corporations to fulfill national strategic objectives, and I make that very clear in this book, just all the different examples of that. We're going to have our economic engines in line with a long-term theory of economic victory. And you can't just play the security contest. You will lose ultimately a security contest with a power that continues to rise. We have not had a military conflict with a power that was our size economically since the War of 1812, and we all know what that was like. So for America to lose ground on the economic strategy, I mean, that's really where we have to go and get very serious and change in many ways the way that we do things. To engage our private sector in U.S. national security strategy is going to be one of the, I think the imperatives of this entire situation.
What do you mean by the triumph over China? What I'm hearing is it's going to be economic. It's not going to be both of us going to war and bloodying each other's nose. It's going to have to happen in boardrooms. It's going to have to happen with the will of economies, more so than us forming alliances with the Germans and the Brits and the French and going in and confronting them. What do you mean by the triumph?
Tony, so again, we have to remember this is a very multidimensional contest. There's absolutely a very real, security and military competition here. And I think there's actually a very high chance of China using its military against, in the Pacific. I mean, they've made absolutely clear, and I explained all this in China's Vision of Victory. They fought most of their neighbors in the 20th century. They fought India, they fought the Soviet Union, they fought the United States and the United Nations in the Korean Peninsula. They fought Vietnam, and they manufactured a series of crises in the Taiwan Straits. So this was a place that had come straight out of a multi-million casualty civil war and went directly into war with its region. So they're not shy about that. And then Xi Jinping has put a very personal, I think, emphasis on this. He speaks on a regular basis about preparing to fight and win wars. And the military he's built is not designed for parades. This is something that's quite serious. But in order to win this whole thing, we have to, I think, regain our position in the world economy, consolidate the alliance system as the real organizing concept for a global economy, and start to roll China back out of this, while at the same time translating all of those gains that we make economically into peace through strength. So the four arenas that I mentioned here, each of them, I think, has an outcome that we want to get to. In the economic arena, it's economic containment of China, coupled with American and allied growth. I mean, we can still grow. We do not depend on China for our growth. So that's something that we have to understand and do. And then in the diplomatic arena, I mean, rolling them back around the alliance system, making sure that they have far less influence, economic and otherwise, in the alliance system, from Japan to Europe to obviously North America itself. And then in the emerging world, the second phase of that, you have to go and compete in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia and all the emerging economies where they're going to be very focused and very capable. And then you get to the military arena, where preponderance, I think, is the right concept. What Winston Churchill and Paul Nietzsche called preponderance, not the balance of power, not a close sort of contest among equals in arms, but rather to bring the allies together so that we have such an overwhelming advantage that any such move on Taiwan or otherwise is a foolish one by the People's Republic of China. And we're losing ground. We're losing the window on very many of these things, which is why the decisive decade is the title. And that's something I talked about in China's Vision of Victory. This is won or lost by 2030. It's not, in that sense, very far away. And then finally, triumph. I mean, the arena of ideas. It's really the triumph of the American and free world ideals, to ensure that the world remains a place that is built by and defined by rights and democracies and free states. I mean, these are the things for which we've fought and worked and died for in the past. And we have to ensure that just because these kinds of adversaries in Beijing and Moscow envision a turning point in world affairs in which, certainly in China's view, they rise to the top of the international system, that turning point never happens. And that's what I mean by triumph, to ensure that the world remains, not only safe, but abundant for the democracies. I mean, that is, at the end of the day, what geopolitics, in my view, is all about. It's, that these contests have consequences. I mean, you cannot lose the Second World War to Germany or Japan. You cannot lose the Cold War to the Soviet Union, and we cannot lose this one to the People's Republic of China.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to reading The Decisive Decade. And when is that scheduled to come out?
Comes out at the end of April.
End of April.
Available for pre-order.
Okay, outstanding. I look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you for listening to In the Know, the Maritime Executive Podcast. We hope you'll join us again for our next exciting industry discussion. In the meantime, you can visit us at maritime-executive.com for top news on critical maritime issues.